In 1937, a man built a house in the freezing, wind-whipped suburbs of Chicago that it literally forced you to take off your winter coat in the dead of winter.
Right.
And he did it without a single furnace turned on. You could be standing in the primary bedroom while a blizzard raged outside, yet the room was bathed in so much natural, trapped warmth that it felt like, a mild spring day.
Which is mind-blowing by today's standards.
It really is.
Yeah.
Today, we are looking at the lost genius of passive architecture and why the modern buildings most of us live and work in have completely forgotten how to survive without being plugged into the grid.
I mean, if your very first thought when designing a building is where to put the air conditioning units and the ductwork, you have already failed.
Wow.
Yeah, jumping straight into mechanical HVAC heating, ventilation, and air conditioning is the ultimate architectural failure. It's an admission of defeat.
Defeat.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You are essentially apologizing for a poorly designed building by brute forcing comfort with fossil fuels.
That is a massive indictment of how we build today. The ultimate architectural failure. And I think it's the perfect place to start this deep dive into the hidden life of buildings. We have a compelling stack of sources on the table for you today. University lectures on environmental comfort, a highly technical architectural manual on bioclimatic strategies, and a visual breakdown of that mid-century modern masterpiece I just mentioned in Chicago.
Some really fantastic material.
Yeah, and our mission today is to take what sounds like incredibly dense building physics, thermodynamics, solar geometry, thermal mass, and translate it into a design-centric narrative. We're looking at architecture not as a static sculpture, but as a living, breathing response to the environment.
And to truly grasp that, we have to fundamentally change how we view the climate itself.
Right.
When an architect looks at a site for a new building, the climate data like the prevailing wind patterns, the specific solar angles at different times of the year, the seasonal humidity swings, those aren't just dry numbers on an engineering spreadsheet.
They're not just constraints.
Exactly. Those data points are the site's DNA. Just as biological DNA dictates the shape, the organs, and the function of a living organism, the climate DNA must dictate the shape, the orientation, and the materiality of the building.
Okay, let's unpack this concept of climate as DNA, because it completely shifts the perspective from imposing a brilliant design on a landscape to basically growing a design out of the landscape.
Growing it out of the data, yes.
But if the climate is the DNA, how does that actually manifest in the physical space for the person living there? What does the occupant actually feel?
Well, it manifests in every single domain of human comfort, in ways you process completely subconsciously. Thermal comfort isn't just an abstract temperature reading on a wall thermostat.
Yeah.
It connects directly to tactile material choices.
Like what you actually touch.
Right. Think of the visceral difference between walking barefoot on a dark, sun-warmed stone floor in the morning versus stepping onto a cold ceramic tile.
Oh, yeah. Huge difference.
And visual comfort connects directly to the atmosphere and emotion of a space. How the natural light is diffused, whether you're squinting against harsh glare or relaxing in soft ambient illumination.
Right, because nobody likes fluorescent office lighting.
Exactly. And acoustic comfort dictates spatial quality and your sense of privacy. Every material choice, every angle of the roof, every placement of a window is a genetic expression of that climatic DNA.
It's funny how the modern, I guess you'd call it the greenwashing industry, has completely inverted this logic. You see developers slap a massive grid of solar panels on top of a highly inefficient glass box office building and market it as a triumph of sustainable architecture. But according to the university lectures we're looking at, that approach is entirely backwards.
It is the ultimate trap. Slapping solar panels on a thermally vulnerable building that requires a massive air conditioner just to remain habitable is entirely missing the point.
So it's like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
Pretty much. There is a strict, non-negotiable pedagogical sequence that governs true sustainable design. It's called the energy hierarchy.
The energy hierarchy. Okay.
Step 1 is always climate analysis mapping, that DNA we just discussed. Step 2 is passive design, using the physical shape, orientation, and materials of the building itself to manage the climate. Step 3, and only step 3, is active systems, the mechanical HVAC.
And renewables.
Step 4, the absolute final step, is renewables.
So solar panels are the last resort, not the first line of defense.
The core thesis of the energy hierarchy is that brilliant passive design drastically reduces the need for active systems. If your passive design is flawless, your active systems can be tiny. They just sip power.
Just sip it.
Right. And because they only sip power, your renewable energy requirements become minimal. You don't need a sprawling solar farm to power a house that naturally regulates its own temperature.
That makes total sense. How should we be visualizing the difference between these passive and active systems, though? The terms get thrown around constantly, but the boundary between them can feel a little blurry for someone just trying to understand their own home.
The most effective way to visualize it is through the metaphor of the human body. Passive solutions are the architecture itself, the skin, the skeleton, the envelope of the building.
The envelope, so like the walls and roof.
Right. It's the thickness of your walls, the type of insulation packed inside them, the specific coatings on your glass, the physical overhanging of your roof. Active solutions are the building's metabolism.
Okay.
They are the internal organs, the veins, the mechanical interventions, the boilers burning fuel, the chillers compressing refrigerant, the pumps pushing water and air through a labyrinth of ductwork.
The skin and the skeleton versus the organs and the veins, that makes a lot of sense. Because your skin, your passive system, is always there, always working, always reacting to the environment without you having to consciously turn it on.
Exactly. You don't plug your skin into a wall outlet.
Right. It naturally protects you, regulates your temperature through sweating or getting goosebumps, and negotiates with the sun.
And a healthy body relies on its skin to do the heavy lifting of thermal regulation before the internal metabolism has to kick into a state of emergency. A healthy building operates the exact same way. It relies on its passive envelope. If the skin is well designed, the mechanical organs barely have to work.
They just kind of coast.
They just gently hum in the background to provide minor fine-tuning during extreme weather events.
But practically speaking, the architect's job changes drastically depending on the patient on the operating table, right? If you're designing a brand new building on an empty lot, you are essentially the geneticist. You have total control over the massing, the overall three-dimensional shape, and the orientation.
You can physically rotate the blueprint.
Yeah, you can just spin it so the living room faces the exact optimal degree south to catch the winter sun.
You are writing the genetic code from scratch, yes.
Yes.
The contextual nuance is everything here. But the manual spends a significant amount of time on the alternative scenario, which is existing buildings.
Right, the stuff we already have.
You cannot pick up a 19th century historic townhouse or a massive broodless concrete library and just rotate it 45 degrees to face the sun.
Right. You're stuck with the skeleton you inherited. So what happens then?
The architect ceases to be a geneticist and becomes a diagnostician. The entire approach shifts to retrofitting and improving performance without erasing the heritage value of the structure.
So you have to figure out what's broken.
You have to diagnose where the skin is failing, where is the heat hemorrhaging out, where is the draft infiltrating. The challenge is performing this upgrade invisibly. You can't just slap a thick layer of cheap modern foam insulation on the exterior of a beautiful, intricate, historic masonry facade.
Because it would ruin the building.
You destroy the heritage. You have to find clever, internal, less invasive ways to upgrade the passive performance so the historical integrity remains untouched while the energy efficiency leaps into the 21st century.
It's like doing minimally invasive arthroscopic surgery on the building's envelope. Okay, so if the passive architecture, the skin and the skeleton, must do the heavy lifting before the mechanical organs kick in, it seems to me that the single most powerful external force this skin has to negotiate with is the sun.
Without question. The architectural relationship with the sun is the primary controlling factor for building design. It dictates the massing, the room layout, and the precise calibration of every window and overhang.
And the sources point out that this isn't some trendy new green initiative either. Solar knowledge was an existential necessity for early civilizations.
Yes, there's a fascinating historical reference in the university lectures. The Greek playwright Aeschylus.
Oh, right.
He actually distinguished between what he called primitive and civilized societies based entirely on their architecture's relationship with the sun.
That's wild. So he wrote that the defining mark of a civilized society was their ability to orient their houses to face the winter sun.
Yes. This sentiment was echoed by Socrates and Xenophon. To the ancients, understanding solar geometry wasn't an aesthetic luxury. It was the baseline of survival and civilization. They understood a fundamental truth that modern air conditioning allowed us to temporarily forget.
Which is?
A building must act as an aggressive filter.
An aggressive filter. I like that phrasing. It's not just a passive box sitting there taking whatever the weather throws at it. It has agency.
It must actively capture the low-angle winter radiation to heat the interior space, while firmly rejecting the high-angle intense radiation of the summer solstice to prevent overheating.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this brings us right back to that house in Chicago I mentioned at the top of the show. The Schweiker House, designed by Paul Schweiker in 1937, located in Schaumburg, Illinois.
A brilliant piece of architecture.
The video tour in our source materials treats this place like a masterclass in aggressive filtering. Walking into the primary bedroom is like stepping inside a massive, precisely calibrated solar instrument. And what's wild to me is the historical context here. This was right after the Great Depression. This wasn't about saving the earth. It was about the brutal financial reality of saving money on coal and heating oil.
Exactly. The financial pressure of the 1930s forced a massive leap in architectural innovation. Let's break down the geometry of that primary bedroom, because it translates the mathematics of the solar system directly into timber and glass.
Okay, let's do it.
In Chicago, if you calculate the angle of the sun at noon on the winter solstice, the shortest, coldest day of the year, when the sun is at its absolute lowest point in the southern sky, that angle is exactly 24.5 degrees.
24.5 degrees. So the sun is practically scraping the horizon, shining straight into your eyes.
Now, Schweiker took that specific 24.5-degree angle and used it to generate the entire architecture of the room. He didn't just guess where the window should go based on the view.
He used the math.
He calibrated the total depth of the room and the exact length of the wooden roof overhang outside the window. He engineered it so that at noon on the winter solstice, that 24.5-degree ray of sunlight passes perfectly under the lip of the overhang, pierces the window, and travels to the absolute furthest back corner of the room where the floor meets the wall.
So it floods the entire depth of the interior with direct solar heat on the exact day of the year you are most desperate for it. The geometry of the room is literally dictated by the solar system. That is staggering.
And the brilliance of the geometry is that it works in reverse for the summer.
Because the sun moves.
Right. On the summer solstice, the sun is high up in the sky, beating down with intense oppressive heat. That same overhanging roof acts like the rigid brim of a baseball cap. Because the angle is so high, the summer sun never penetrates the glazing. The interior remains in deep, cool shadow.
So it's blocking the heat without any moving parts.
The geometry is so airtight that the room requires zero mechanical cooling. It is an investment in pure geometric logic.
But I want to challenge this a bit, because while capturing all that winter heat is great, the video tour highlights something on the opposite side of that bedroom.
The transoms.
Yeah. On the north wall, high up near the ceiling above the closets, there are these small transom windows. If the massive south-facing windows are doing all the heavy lifting for winter heating, what is the point of these tiny northern windows? Do they really matter, or are they just there to let in a bit of diffuse, indirect light?
Oh, they matter immensely. Those northern transoms are the second half of the passive engine. They exploit thermodynamics for convective cooling.
Convective cooling.
Consider what happens to air molecules when they get warm.
They expand, they become less dense, and they rise.
Exactly. During the summer, even with the overhang completely blocking direct sunlight, the ambient air inside the room will inevitably warm up from human bodies, ambient outdoor temperatures, and just general usage. That warm air naturally rises to the ceiling.
So it gets trapped up there.
Unless you have an exit. By opening those high northern transom windows, Schweiker gives that buoyant hot air an escape route. As the hot air flows out of those high windows, it creates a slight negative pressure, a vacuum lower down in the room.
Oh, I see.
This vacuum then naturally draws in cooler, fresh air from the lower shaded openings on the other side of the house.
So the building is physically exhaling the stale, hot air and inhaling the cool air. It's breathing, driven entirely by the natural physics of heat rising.
This illustrates the dual nature of solar design. You strategically capture radiation for heating in the winter, and you exploit thermodynamic pull to drive convective cooling in the summer. The building becomes an active participant in its own climate control.
Which naturally leads us to the boundary line where all this interaction actually takes place, the envelope of the building, the skin. We've talked about the angles of the sun and the flow of air, but the actual ratio of solid wall to glass window is a massive factor. The sources refer to this as a glazing-to-opaque wall ratio.
It is arguably the single most decisive determinant of energy efficiency in the entire thermal envelope. Every time you punch a hole in a highly insulated opaque wall to install a glass window, you are introducing a profound thermodynamic vulnerability.
Even with modern glass.
Even then. Glass, even the most advanced modern glass, is a terrible insulator compared to a solid, well-insulated wall.
So it's a constant compromise. You need glass for natural light for views and for capturing that winter solar heat, but too much glass, and you just bleed energy into the night sky. I imagine the rules for this aren't just left up to the architect's aesthetic whim.
Not at all. It is highly regulated, and the benchmarks shift drastically depending on regional climate. The Architectural Manual provides a brilliant case study by examining Portuguese legislative guidelines, known as the SCE.
Okay, the SE8.
In Portugal, the law strictly limits north-facing glazing to a maximum of 5% of the compartment area.
Wait, 5%? That sounds miserable. You're telling me, for the sake of thermodynamics, architects are legally forced to build dark, depressing rooms on the north side of a house. Isn't mental well-being and access to natural light just as important as saving a few bucks on heating?
It is a harsh restriction, but you have to understand the physics driving the legislation. Think about the path of the sun in the northern hemisphere. The north facade of a building receives virtually zero direct solar radiation throughout the entire year. It's perpetually in shadow.
All right.
If you install a massive floor-to-ceiling window on the north wall, you are getting absolutely zero solar heat gain in the winter. All that window does is act as a giant freezing cold surface where your expensive mechanically generated indoor heat conducts straight out into the winter night.
It's a thermodynamic black hole. It just sucks the heat out of the room faster than your furnace can replace it.
Precisely. So the legislation limits it to 5% to allow for the absolute minimum natural ventilation and a sliver of diffused daylight, but no more, because the energy penalty is simply too high. But contrast that with the other orientations. For the east, south, and west facades, the Portuguese guidelines allow a glazing ratio of up to 15%.
Okay, but I have a logical question here.
Go ahead.
If the south wall is the golden ticket, if it's the one that gets all that beautiful low-angle winter heat that we just talked about with the Schweiker House, why stop at 15%?
Yeah.
Why not just make the entire south facade 100% floor-to-ceiling glass wall to capture as much heat as humanly possible? If more sun is good, shouldn't maximum sun be better?
It's an intuitive leap, but it's a mistake many young architects make, leading to disastrous consequences. While a 100% glazed south facade is technically possible to build, experts warn that it creates what is known as a thermally fragile wall.
Thermally fragile, meaning it's volatile. It swings to extremes.
Yes, it is incredibly volatile. You will absolutely capture a massive amount of heat during a sunny winter day. But remember, our foundational rule glass is a poor insulator. As soon as the sun goes down and the outdoor temperature plummets, that 100% glass wall becomes a massive surface for heat loss.
So the trap works both ways.
Exactly. All the heat you gain during the day will hemorrhage out through the glass at night. To compensate for a wall like that, you would have to install enormous, expensive exterior shading fins, called palace in the literature, and robust, heavily insulated shutters that automatically close every single night to trap the heat inside.
So it stops being a passive system and becomes a high-maintenance machine. You're constantly fighting the fragility of the material. If the shutters break, you freeze.
The goal is optimization, not maximization. In Mediterranean climates like Portugal, the objective is to optimize the south facade, perhaps pushing it to 30–35% overall if you have the right protections in place, while strictly controlling the east and west.
Why are east and west so tricky?
Because of the low-angle sun in the early morning and late evening, it causes blinding glare, and in the summer, the west sun can severely overheat a space right at the end of the day, exactly when you want the building to be cooling down for the evening.
And I imagine these mathematical ratios change completely the moment you move out of a warm Mediterranean climate. If you are in a colder, cloudier climate, does the math flip?
Drastically. The variation is entirely driven by the local availability of solar hours. In California or Southern Europe, the sun is so intense that you can achieve significant thermal gain with relatively small windows. But if you look at the guidelines for Germany or Poland, the authorities suggest pushing the south-facing glazing up to 35 or even 40%.
Because they are starved for sunlight. They have such limited sun hours in the depths of winter that when the sun finally does peek through the clouds, they need a massive net to catch it.
It's a larger net for a scarcer resource. Meanwhile, the UK standards, which deal with a lot of diffuse, cloudy light but milder winters, sit around 20–25%. And there's a foundational manual in European sustainable design called Green Vitruvius that suggests a holistic average of 30% glazing for the entire building as a highly reliable starting baseline.
A good rule of thumb.
Right. But the key takeaway is that the envelope must be a hyperlocalized response to the specific climate DNA.
Oh, so if we can't just build these infinite glass boxes because they are too fragile, it means the glass we do use has to be incredibly smart. It has to actively manage the heat, not just let it pass through blindly. Which brings us to the actual thermodynamics of the glass itself.
Hmm.
And there is an analogy in the sources that clarifies this perfectly, the sunglasses paradigm.
Standard, old-fashioned, single-pane clear glass is a thermodynamic disaster. The statistics in the manual are sobering. Standard clear glass is responsible for approximately 60% of summer heat gains in a building and 25% of winter heat losses.
That's horrible.
A poorly designed window system can single-handedly destroy your building's energy efficiency by up to 35%. You might as well just leave a giant hole in the wall.
So how does modern glass fix this? If you're sitting in a typical apartment right now listening to this and you look at your window, odds are it's hemorrhaging heat and your thermostat is fighting a war that the glass is losing. How do modern skyscrapers deal with the fact that we want the light, but we don't always want the heat?
They do it through spectral selectivity, which is where the sunglasses analogy comes in. Imagine putting on a pair of high-end polarized sunglasses. They don't just make everything uniformly dark. They selectively filter out the harsh glare and the harmful UV rays while still letting the visible light through so you can see clearly.
So the glass acts like a filter.
Modern architectural glass does this on a thermodynamic level using low emissivity or low E coatings.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics of this low-E coating. What is actually happening at the microscopic level?
A low E coating is an incredibly thin, microscopically thin layer of metal, often silver or tin, that is applied directly to the surface of the glass pane during manufacturing. To understand why this metallic layer works, we have to look at the physics of solar radiation.
Right, so waves.
The energy coming directly from the sun arrives in the form of shortwave radiation. This shortwave radiation is incredibly penetrating. It easily passes right through the clear glass and right through the microscopic metallic coating. It brings the visible light into the room.
Okay, so the shortwave light gets in, but what about the heat?
Here is the thermodynamic magic. When that shortwave solar radiation enters the room and hits the furniture, the floor, or the interior walls, it is absorbed. Those physical objects heat up, and as they heat up, they begin to re-radiate that energy back out into the space. But they don't re-radiate it as shortwave light.
What does it become?
They re-radiate it as long-wave infrared radiation. This is what we feel as heat.
Right, like the waves of heat you can literally see radiating off a dark asphalt road in the middle of summer.
Exactly. Now that long-wave infrared heat tries to escape back out through the window, but the low-E metallic coating behaves completely differently toward long-wave radiation. It is highly reflective to it. It acts like a thermal mirror. It bounces the heat right back into the room.
So in the winter, it lets the solar light in to warm up the room, and then when the room tries to bleed that heat back out into the freezing night, the window acts as a shield, bouncing it back inside. It's a one-way valve for energy.
And the placement of that microscopic coating is highly strategic depending on the climate DNA. In a double-glazed window, which consists of two panes of glass separated by a sealed gap, there are four surfaces. Surface 1 is the absolute exterior facing the outside world. Surface 4 is the absolute interior facing the inside of the room.
Okay, got it. 1 to 4, outside to inside.
In a cold climate, architects specify placing the low-E coating on surface 3, the outside of the inner pane. This configuration lets the maximum amount of solar heat in, but fiercely traps the interior long-wave heat from escaping.
But what if you were building an office tower in Dubai? You definitely don't want to trap heat inside. You'd bake everyone alive.
In a hot climate, you flip the strategy entirely. You place the low-E coating on surface 2, the inside of the outer pane. In this configuration, the coating intercepts the intense solar heat before it even crosses the air gap, reflecting it back outwards. You're essentially sacrificing the outer pane of glass to protect the inner sanctuary of the building.
The sunglasses paradigm. It sacrifices the outer layer to reflect the harsh heat while letting the visible light pass through. That is brilliant. And the space between those two panes of glass isn't just empty air, right? The sources mention filling that gap with specific gases.
Typically argon or krypton gas. These noble gases are significantly denser and far less thermally conductive than normal atmospheric air. They drastically slow down the convective heat transfer between the two panes of glass.
So it's harder for the heat to move across the gap.
If heat trying to move through normal air is like a person running down a sidewalk, heat trying to move through argon gas is like a person trying to run through waist-deep water. The thermal energy just can't move as fast.
When architects are actually looking at catalogs of this high-tech glass, what are the actual metrics they use to make decisions? The sources list a bunch of acronyms, but what do they actually mean in practice? How do you measure if a window is basically a hole in the wall versus a highly tuned thermal mirror?
There are two vital metrics you need to memorize. The first is the U factor, or U value. This measures conductive, non-solar heat transfer. Simply put, how well does the window insulate against the ambient outdoor temperature?
So lower is better.
A lower U value is always better. It means less heat is escaping through the material itself. The best high-performance glass today can achieve U values as low as 1.0 or even lower.
Okay, lower U value means better insulation, like putting on a thicker winter coat. What's the second metric?
The second is the solar heat gain coefficient, or SHGC. This measures the fraction of direct solar radiation that actually makes it through the glass and into the room. This is where climate context is everything.
How so?
In a hot climate, you want a very low SHGC, something under 0.25, to aggressively block the sun's heat and reject it outside. But in a cold climate, you actually want a higher SHGC to welcome that free passive heating from the sun.
It's a constant, delicate negotiation with the climate DNA. But wait, this brings up a crucial logistical question. Say it's winter, and we've designed our Schweiker-style overhang, we've got our optimal 35% glazing ratio facing south, and we have high SHGC, low-E glass letting all this glorious shortwave radiation in.
Sounds perfect.
The room is getting bombarded with solar energy all morning. What happens to all that heat? Doesn't the room just turn into a suffocating sauna by 2 in the afternoon and then freeze solid as soon as the sun sets?
That is exactly what would happen if you were sitting in a lightweight, uninsulated tin shack. The air would heat up instantly and dissipate instantly. This is where the concept of thermal mass comes into play. We use dense, heavy materials like concrete, natural stone, or thick brick floors to act as a temperature battery.
A temperature battery.
Think of these dense materials like a sponge for heat. Direct gain passive solar heating is the most common method. The solar radiation enters the living space and strikes these high-mass materials. Instead of the air instantly heating up and making you sweat, the concrete floor absorbs the energy deep into its core.
It's sucking it out of the air.
It charges the battery throughout the day. The surface temperature of the floor might feel pleasantly warm to your bare feet, but the ambient air in the room remains perfectly comfortable.
It's soaking up the excess energy so the room doesn't overheat during the peak sun hours.
And then, the true benefit reveals itself at night. As the sun sets and the ambient temperature of the room begins to drop, the temperature battery kicks in. Because of thermal inertia, the concrete floor slowly begins to discharge the immense amount of heat it stored all day, gently radiating it back into the room to keep the space warm through the freezing night.
It's a completely passive energy storage system. You are literally banking the afternoon sun to spend it at midnight. Now, that is direct gain, the sun directly hitting the floor you were standing on, but the manual also details indirect gain, which uses a thermal mediator, and the most famous example of this is the Trombe wall.
Yes, the Trombe wall.
Can you walk us through how a Trombe wall works? Because on paper, it sounds like a paradox. It's a wall that intentionally blocks the sun, but somehow heats the building.
It is a brilliant piece of 19th century engineering, named after the French engineer Félix Trombe. Imagine a thick, massive wall made of dark-painted concrete or solid stone. But this wall isn't on the inside of the room. It forms the exterior south-facing facade of the building.
Okay, a big, heavy black stone wall facing the sun.
Now, a few inches in front of that dark wall, you install a massive pane of exterior glass. So you have the glass, a small sealed air gap, and then the dark, heavy wall. When the sunlight hits the building, the shortwave radiation passes effortlessly right through the glass.
Just like the sunglasses paradigm, the glass lets the shortwave light in.
That shortwave energy crosses the tiny air gap and strikes the dark concrete wall. The dark color maximizes absorption, so the surface of the wall heats up immensely. As the wall heats up, it begins to re-radiate that energy. But remember the physics, it re-radiates it as long-wave infrared heat.
And the glass is opaque to long-wave radiation. It acts like a mirror to the heat.
Exactly. The long-wave heat tries to radiate back outside, but the glass blocks it. The heat is physically trapped in that tiny air gap between the glass and the wall. This creates a perfect, highly localized greenhouse effect. The temperature in that small air gap skyrockets.
Okay, so you have a pocket of incredibly hot air trapped against the outside of your building. But wait, building a massive black wall out of solid concrete sounds incredibly carbon-intensive up front, and it completely blocks your view. Is the payoff really there? How does this trapped heat outside actually help the people inside?
The payoff is substantial because it delivers heat in two distinct ways. First, conduction. That massive heat slowly migrates through the dense thickness of the concrete wall over a period of several hours. By the time the heat finally reaches the interior surface of the wall, it's nighttime. The wall then gently radiates that warmth into the living space while everyone is sleeping.
That's the temperature battery concept again, just delayed.
But the second way is even more immediate in dynamic convection. You install small operable vents at the top and the bottom of the Trombe wall, connecting the interior room directly to the trapped air gap. As the air in the gap heats up to intense temperatures, it expands and rises rapidly. This buoyant hot air is forced through the top vent directly into the living space.
It creates a thermal current.
The rising hot air leaving the gap creates a vacuum at the bottom vent, which pulls the cooler air from the floor of the living space into the bottom of the air gap, where it gets heated against the hot wall, rises, and gets pushed back into the room. It creates a continuous convective loop, a completely natural zero-energy heater that silently circulates warm air throughout the house all day long.
But what if I'm already warm? Does this system account for human preference? Or does it just blast heat blindly into the room until everyone is sweating?
That is the beauty of the operable vents. If the room is warm enough, you simply close the interior vents. The heat is trapped in the wall and continues its slow conductive journey for nighttime use, but the immediate convective heating stops.
Oh, that's clever.
Furthermore, you can invert these systems in the summer. You open vents to the outside instead of the inside, and that same intense heat rising up the Trombe wall acts like a thermal engine, drawing hot air out of the house and pulling cool air in from the shaded northern side. It becomes a solar chimney.
It's the stack effect in action. You are using the brutal heat of the sun to power a natural air conditioner. The building is breezing, driven entirely by the thermodynamics of pressure and temperature gradients. Which is fascinating, but it naturally raises the next question.
Which is?
So what does this all mean for the human beings actually living inside these thermodynamic machines? We've talked about U values, solar angles, convective loops, but ultimately architecture is for people. How do we actually measure if these passive systems are making the space comfortable? Because comfort feels like such a subjective, emotional thing. Think about the last time you're in an office, half the people are freezing in sweaters and the other half are sweating in t-shirts.
This is where architectural physics intersects with human biology and psychology. For decades, the commercial building industry relied on a very rigid metric called the PMV model, the predicted mean vote. It was developed in the 1970s for mechanically air-conditioned office buildings.
Predicted mean vote, what exactly were they voting on?
In the 1970s, researchers literally put people into sealed climate chambers, manipulated the temperature and humidity, and had them vote on a 7-point scale regarding their thermal sensation, from cold to hot.
Just trapped in a box voting on the heat.
From these votes, they derived a mathematical equation. The PMV model essentially assumes that humans are passive thermal receptacles. It dictates that to achieve comfort for the maximum number of people, a building must use massive mechanical HVAC systems to forcibly maintain the indoor environment at a perfectly static 22 degrees Celsius, 50% humidity, with zero air movement 365 days a year, regardless of whether there is a blizzard or a heat wave outside.
It treats the building like a hermetically sealed Tupperware container, and the humans inside like delicate produce.
It requires an immense amount of energy, and ironically, it often leads to sick building syndrome and high levels of occupant dissatisfaction, because humans are not static creatures. We evolved in dynamic natural environments.
Which is why the sources introduce a competing, much more modern model, the adaptive comfort model, or the ATHB, the adaptive thermal heat balance. This feels like a much more holistic approach.
The adaptive comfort model represents a paradigm shift in architecture. It acknowledges a fundamental biological truth: the human thermostat is flexible. It proves mathematically that our perception of comfort is not a static number, but a dynamic relationship with our environment.
So it changes based on what's outside.
The ATHB model modifies the acceptable indoor temperature based on the running mean outdoor temperature. If it is a hot summer week, our bodies biologically adapt to accept higher indoor temperatures as comfortable. If it's winter, we adapt to cooler indoor temperatures.
Right, because we change our clothing, our metabolism shifts, our expectations change. The sources even mention physiological feedback loops linking thermal sensation to objective biological variables like wrist skin temperature and heart rate. It's actual biology.
But the most fascinating aspect of the adaptive model isn't physiological, it's psychological adaptation. Extensive studies show that if you put a person in a sealed, air-conditioned room where they have absolutely no control and the temperature rises to 25 degrees Celsius, they will report feeling uncomfortably hot, frustrated, and demand the AC be turned up.
Okay, because they feel trapped in a failing system.
But if you put that exact same person in a passively designed room at that exact same 25 degrees Celsius, but you give them an operable window or an adjustable sunshade or a ceiling fan they can turn on, their tolerance for temperature variation drastically increases. They will report feeling perfectly comfortable.
Because they have agency. The psychological feeling of having control over your environment actually changes your physiological perception of the heat.
Providing occupants with the tools to manage their environment is infinitely more effective for both human satisfaction and energy efficiency than maintaining a static, mechanically enforced climate. By relying on operable windows for a breeze or drawing a shade against the afternoon sun, we allow the building and the human to collaborate. The flexibility of the human thermostat saves immense amounts of energy.
If human biology adapts to the environment to save energy, are there examples of non-human biology doing this even better? Does nature already have a blueprint for this? Because the sources highlight an incredible case study in Kenya that completely blew my mind. The startup Lions campus in Turkana County, designed by Kyrie Architecture.
This project is a landmark example of biomimicry looking to natural biological systems for thermal management solutions. Turkana County is a region of extreme, punishing heat and dust, and the campus's purpose is to provide information and communication technology training for local youth.
So they have rooms full of sensitive computer servers and electronics, which generate their own massive amount of internal heat sitting in one of the hottest environments on Earth. The standard PMV approach would be to drop a massive industrial air conditioning unit on the roof and run it 24/7.
Which is ecologically devastating and economically unviable in that context. They couldn't rely on the grid. Instead, Kyrie Architecture looked at the vernacular wisdom of the local landscape, specifically the termite mounds that dot the Kenyan savanna.
Termite mounds.
Termites are master architects. They build these towering earthen mounds that maintain a perfectly stable, cool internal temperature for their colony, regardless of the blazing sun outside.
How do a bunch of insects build an air conditioner without electricity?
Through the stack effect and thermal mass. And Kyrie translated this brilliantly into the startup Lions campus. The buildings feature these towering, distinctively shaped terracotta chimneys that reach high into the sky. These aren't just aesthetic flourishes to make the building look interesting. They are the engines of the cooling system.
Just like the Trombe Wall acting as a solar chimney?
The mechanism is identical. The tall terracotta towers heat up in the intense African sun. The air inside them becomes incredibly hot, expands, and rushes upward out of the top of the tower. This creates a powerful constant vacuum at the bottom of the building.
And where's the replacement air come from?
Kira designed specialized low-level intake vents, inspired directly by the intake tunnels of the termite mounds. These vents draw in fresh air from the shaded, cooler areas near the ground. As the hot air blasts out the top of the towers, it constantly pulls a cooling breeze through the low vents across the human occupants and through the server rooms.
It's a continuous wind tunnel effect driven entirely by the heat of the sun. The hotter the sun beats down on the towers, the faster the air moves through the building.
Furthermore, these low-level vents are adjustable, allowing them to control the intake of the abrasive local dust. And the buildings themselves are constructed using locally sourced quarry stone, providing massive thermal inertia, our temperature battery, to smooth out the daily temperature spikes.
It all connects.
They also incorporate double roof structures, a principle Carey pioneered in his early Gondo School projects, providing a secondary shade layer to drastically reduce the direct solar gain on the primary roof.
And the result of all this biomimicry. The lecture notes state, this zero-energy cooling system drops the interior temperature by a staggering 10 degrees Celsius compared to the outside air, 10 degrees. With zero mechanical air conditioning. It protects the servers, keeps the students comfortable, and costs nothing to operate.
It is the absolute triumph of passive design. You're collaborating with the site's DNA rather than fighting it. Now, contrast that biomimetic vernacular approach in Kenya with the high-tech approaches required in sub-zero northern climates.
Right, because a termite mound tower isn't going to help you in a blizzard in Warsaw. If anything, it would freeze you faster.
In extreme cold, the strategy shifts from heat rejection to aggressive heat hoarding. This is where we see the implementation of the passive house standard, which originated in Germany. It represents the rigorous, high-tech synthesis of all these passive principles.
Hoarding the heat.
Yes. In a sub-zero climate, you aren't using breathable terracotta towers. You are using highly engineered triple-glazed windows with thick argon gas fills and microscopic low-E coatings on multiple surfaces. You are building envelopes so extraordinarily airtight and heavily insulated that a single candle, or the body heat of a few people, could practically heat the room.
The Passive House standards set some intense metrics for success. The notes list target temperatures of 18 to 20 degrees Celsius in the winter and 25 to 27 degrees Celsius in the summer. They strictly limit air movement to avoid drafts, all zero point 0.1 to 0.15 meters per second in winter. And they aim for a balanced 40 to 60% humidity depending on the season.
And tying it all back to our earlier discussion, the Passive House standard often points back to the 30% baseline glazing ratio mentioned in the Green Vitruvius manual. It is a holistic, deeply mathematical approach to ensuring the skin and the skeleton of the building perform flawlessly before a single drop of fossil fuel is burned for mechanical heating.
It's a vast amount of information to synthesize, from the exact 24.5-degree geometry of the sun, to the thermodynamics of gas-filled glass, to the psychology of an open window, to the biomimicry of termite mounds. For our listeners who want to actually see these strategies visualized and mapped out for their own local climates, the professor's materials explicitly mention a fantastic primary resource tool called the 2030 Palette.
Yes, 2030palette.org. It is an indispensable resource for anyone interested in this field. It visually catalogs these passive design strategies, breaking them down by region, scale, and specific application. It is essentially a global database of climate DNA and the architectural responses that fit them. Anyone interested in understanding how buildings interact with nature should spend time exploring it.
We've covered a massive amount of ground today. If we zoom out and summarize the core lesson of this deep dive, it's that great architecture is fundamentally not about imposing our will on the environment. It's not about fighting the climate with massive energy-guzzling air conditioners and furnaces. It is about a deep structural collaboration with the site's DNA.
From the precise solar geometry dictating the room depth in the Schweiker House, to the heavy, dark thermal mass of a Trombe wall banking the sun's energy for the night, down to the terracotta termite mounds driving zero-energy cooling in Kenya. The building's skin and skeleton must do the work. The architecture itself is the technology.
And that brings us back to where we started. If you jump straight to the HVAC, you bypass the genius of the architecture. Which leaves me with a final, somewhat provocative thought to mull over. As our global climate rapidly shifts, as the summers get hotter, the winters get more unpredictable, and the weather patterns become more extreme, our reliance on fragile power grids to run those massive mechanical air conditioners becomes a massive vulnerability.
A vulnerability that passive design entirely inoculates us against.
Exactly. So here's a question for you to take away. 100 years from now, will the heritage buildings of tomorrow be judged not by the aesthetic beauty of their glass facades, but by how flawlessly their geometry and their temperature batteries negotiated their survival off the grid? Could the physical shape of a building eventually become the most accurate historical fossil record of the specific climate chaos it was built to withstand?
It's a compelling paradigm shift. The architecture ceases to be mere shelter and becomes a permanent record of the atmosphere it was forced to negotiate with.
Something to think about the next time you walk past a gleaming glass skyscraper and hear the deafening hum of a massive air conditioning unit struggling to keep it alive. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.